Alexander the Great, the 20-year-old who conquered the world. At just 20 years old, he inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies. By 30, he ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. This is the story of the boy who refused to be ordinary. This is Alexander the Great. Chapter I: The boy destined for greatness. Music, deep drums, distant horns, ancient and brooding. Macedonia, 356 BC. A land of mountains and war. A kingdom perched at the northern edge of the Greek world, looked down upon by the great city-states of Athens and Corinth and Thebes as something half-civilized, too rough, too cold, too far from the marble temples and philosophical academies of the south. A land where kings were made not by birthright alone, but by blood, will, and the gods themselves. Into this world, a boy was born who would one day make the gods envious. The night of his birth was marked, according to ancient sources, by extraordinary omens. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground that same night. Persian magi who interpreted the omen declared it a sign that a great destroyer of Asia had been born. They were right. They simply had no idea how right. From his earliest years, Alexander was no ordinary child. While other boys of the Macedonian court played at swords and chased horses through the lower fields, Alexander watched. He studied. His dark eyes traced every detail, the posture of a general, the weight of a shield, the silence before a soldier shouts his war cry. He was a child who seemed to be in a permanent state of measuring the world against a standard only he could see and finding it slightly too small. His mother, Queen Olympias, was a force of nature, fierce, mystical, and burning with ambition for her son. She was a princess of Epirus, a woman of fierce religious devotion who participated in the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, who kept sacred snakes in her chambers, who communed with forces that more rational men preferred not to name. She whispered to him of gods and prophecies. She told him he was descended from Achilles on her side, and from Heracles through his father. She made him believe, truly believe, that he was chosen. Olympias placing her hands on the boy's shoulders, her voice low and absolute. "You are not merely the son of Philip. You carry the blood of Achilles in your veins. The gods did not place you here to be forgotten, my son. They placed you here to be remembered forever." Whether this was a mother's love speaking, or genuine belief in divine destiny, or a calculated strategy to fill her son with an ambition that would carry him beyond any rival, perhaps it was all three. Olympias was not a simple woman. She understood that the story a child tells himself about who he is becomes, in time, the story he lives. His father, King Philip II, shaped him differently. Philip was a warrior king of extraordinary ability who had spent his reign transforming Macedonia from a minor kingdom, perpetually threatened by its neighbors, into the dominant military power in the Greek world. He had reformed the army, inventing the phalanx formation that would make Macedonian infantry the most fearsome in the world. He had won wars through diplomacy as often as through battle, and through deception as often as either. He was a chess player in a world of checkers players, and he saw in his son something that thrilled and perhaps frightened him. All of his own abilities, amplified and stripped of the pragmatic caution that had made Philip merely great rather than legendary. He gave Alexander something more dangerous than mythology. He gave him discipline, tactics, and hunger. The relationship between father and son was complex and deeply felt on both sides. Philip loved Alexander fiercely, but their similarities created friction as much as bond. When Philip took a second wife, Cleopatra of Macedon, and her uncle made a toast at the wedding implying that a legitimate heir would now replace the half-barbarian Alexander, Alexander threw his cup at the man's head. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son, so drunk he fell before reaching him. Alexander looked down at his father on the floor and said, with cold precision, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia and who cannot even cross from one table to another without falling." He fled with his mother that night. The wound between them was real, but it healed because it had to. They needed each other too much. But it was one afternoon that would define Alexander's legend before his legend had even begun. A horse dealer arrived at the royal court with a massive, jet-black stallion of terrifying power. The horse was named Bucephalus, meaning ox-headed, and it had already thrown every rider who attempted to mount it. Philip's finest horsemen failed one after another. The animal reared, kicked, screamed. It seemed less like a horse and more like a force of nature wearing the shape of one. The boy was 12 years old when he walked forward from the crowd. Alexander quietly, to no one in particular. What a horse they are losing, for want of skill and courage to manage him. Philip turned half amused, half furious. He told his son, "If you can ride him, I will buy him. If you fail, you will pay the full price yourself." The crowd tensed. The courtiers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The horse dealers watched with professional detachment. Alexander had noticed something the others had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Each time a rider approached from one side, Bucephalus saw the shifting, monstrous shape of its own reflection on the ground and panicked. It was not a wild horse. It was a frightened one. Alexander turned Bucephalus to face the sun directly, removing the shadow from its sight. Then slowly, calmly, speaking in a low voice, he stroked the animal's neck and flank and mounted him without a sound. The horse did not buck. It ran, and the boy rode it like a god on the wind, galloping the full length of the field and back, controlling 2,000 pounds of pure terror with nothing but calm authority, and the understanding that the secret to mastering something powerful is first to understand what it fears. When Alexander finally turned back toward the crowd, his father had tears in his eyes. Philip, watching his son dismount, his voice thick with something too large for simple pride. "My son, you must find a kingdom worthy of yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." Bucephalus would carry Alexander for the next 20 years, across every battlefield from Greece to India. When the horse finally died of wounds sustained in battle at the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, already old, already legendary, Alexander founded a city in his memory and named it Bucephala. Even in death, the horse was honored as a companion rather than a possession. Side story: the boy who stared at stars. Long after the palace fires dimmed and the servants retired, a boy sat alone on the stone steps of the upper palace, neck craned to the heavens. The sky above Macedonia was vast and clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes the stars look close enough to touch, that makes the distance between them feel personal rather than astronomical. He traced the constellations, the hunter, the bear, the river of stars that stretched toward the edge of sight, and something stirred behind those young eyes, not just wonder, longing, the specific, aching longing of someone who recognizes that the world they have been placed in is too small and who does not yet know what to do with that recognition. His tutors had taught him the names of the stars. Aristotle, in the years to come, would teach him their movements, their relationships, the way they could be used to navigate across unknown seas. But at 12, sitting alone on cold stone, Alexander did not think about navigation. He thought about the space between the stars, the vast, uncharted darkness that separated one known point of light from another. He thought, that is where I want to go. Years later, his generals would tell a story. No matter where Alexander camped across the Hellespont, in the deserts of Persia, at the edge of the known world, he would slip away at night and sit alone under the sky. His bodyguards learned to expect it and give him space. His closest friends, Hephaestion above all, sometimes joined him in silence without speaking, understanding that these were not moments for conversation. As if the stars were the only things that understood the size of his ambition, as if they were the only things large enough to hold it. But childhood ends, and the world does not wait for boys, no matter how destined they may be. Chapter II, the student of Aristotle. Music, soft strings, contemplative and slow. 356 BC, a father who conquers with armies. A son who would conquer with something more powerful, a mind trained by the greatest philosopher who ever lived. When Alexander was 13, Philip did something that separated him from every other king of his era. He hired the best teacher alive. Not a competent court tutor, not a soldier poet who could recite verse and instruct swordsmanship simultaneously, but Aristotle of Stagira, the man who would go on to write foundational texts on logic, biology, physics, politics, ethics, poetry, and rhetoric, and who remains, 24 centuries later, one of the most influential thinkers in the history of human civilization. Philip offered Aristotle generous payment and the restoration of his hometown of Stagira, which Philip had previously destroyed. In exchange, Aristotle would shape the mind of a prince. It was, from both sides, an extraordinary bargain. The classroom was a grove near Macedon, a quiet sanctuary of trees and marble benches where ideas moved through air like living things. Away from the noise of court, away from the daily machinery of governance and military preparation, teacher and student spent 3 years in a space devoted entirely to thought. Aristotle taught Alexander not merely philosophy, but medicine, science, botany, politics, rhetoric, and the art of war. He taught him to observe before concluding, to question before accepting, to never mistake the map for the territory. He gave Alexander a love of Homer, but also a love of inquiry. The understanding that the world was not fixed and known but dynamic and endlessly discoverable, and that a man who chose to understand it would always hold an advantage over a man who merely inherited assumptions about it. He taught him geography, the shape of the known world, the position of rivers and mountain ranges, the climate patterns that would determine where armies could march and when, and where they would be slowed or stopped. He taught him medicine so thoroughly that Alexander would later in his campaigns suggest treatments to his own physicians, sometimes correctly. He gave him an annotated copy of the Iliad and told him, "Read this as literature, not as scripture. Understand what makes Achilles compelling. Then decide whether you want to be compelling in the same way." Aristotle, pausing mid-lecture, pointing at his student, "You will meet men who believe that gods decide the outcomes of battles. They are wrong. Preparation decides. Knowledge decides. A soldier fights for 10 minutes. A general thinks for 10 years." Alexander absorbed all of it. He was, by every account, a remarkable student, quick, argumentative in the best sense, unwilling to accept a premise without testing it, but genuinely hungry for knowledge rather than merely performing the appearance of hunger. He and Aristotle maintained a correspondence throughout his campaigns. When Alexander captured the royal library at Persepolis, he sent scrolls back to his teacher. Even at the far edge of the known world, surrounded by war and conquest and the daily administration of a massive empire, he wrote to the man who had taught him to think. But one text above all others consumed him with a fire no tutor could fully contain: Homer's Iliad. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, the man who chose a short, blazing life of glory over a long, quiet existence of comfort, the man who knew he would die young and chose it anyway, because the alternative, a long life without legend, was worse than death. Every page of the Iliad burned in Alexander's chest like a fever. He did not read it as history or as poetry. He read it as instruction, as prophecy, as a mirror in which he could see the outline of who he intended to become. Aristotle gave Alexander an annotated copy, and Alexander kept it beneath his pillow beside a dagger, as if both were equally necessary tools for survival. Personal life moment, the Iliad under his pillow. Every morning when the palace servants entered to prepare his chambers, they found it the same: the worn copy of the Iliad on the bedside table, the pages soft and creased from 1,000 readings, the margins dense with Alexander's own notes in his small, precise handwriting. He had annotated it the way a general annotates a battle plan: notes on Achilles' tactics at specific engagements, notes on the psychology of his enemies, on how fear and pride operated in the men who faced him, notes on the moments where Achilles made errors and what those errors cost him. It was not the reading of a romantic young man lost in heroic fantasy. It was the reading of someone studying a competitor. Alexander never merely admired Achilles. He competed with him. Each campaign he planned in his mind was measured against the deeds of the great warrior. He didn't want to equal Achilles. He wanted to surpass every hero in the Iliad, every hero in history, every name that had ever been spoken with reverence or fear. Those who knew him in these years noted that the ambition was entirely genuine, not performance, not rhetoric, but a deep, structural feature of how he understood himself and his place in the world. He believed he was destined for greatness not because greatness would come to him, but because he intended to pursue it with a ferocity and intelligence that would leave history no choice but to record him. When his tutor Lysimachus told stories of heroic deeds, Alexander would grow very still, and then he would say one sentence quietly with absolute certainty. "I will do more." He said it without arrogance. That was the remarkable thing. He said it the way a craftsman states a fact about the work they intend to produce, with calm, professional certainty and the full weight of preparation behind it. Knowledge is a weapon, and Alexander was now armed. The question was, what would he use it for? Chapter III, a prince turned king at 20. Music, sudden silence, then low and mournful strings. 336 BC. The world changed in a single night, and nothing that followed would ever be the same. Philip II, conqueror of Greece, architect of the Macedonian Empire, one of the most capable military and political minds of the ancient world, was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding celebration. Cut down in a corridor by a man named Pausanias while his court drank and laughed around him. The reasons behind the assassination were complex. Pausanias had personal grievances, but ancient sources hint at deeper conspiracies, possibly reaching into the Persian court, possibly closer to home. Some whispered that Olympias herself had played a role. Nothing was ever proven. Philip was simply gone. In an instant, the most powerful king in the Greek world lay dead on a marble floor. Alexander was 20 years old. He was king. And within hours, every enemy Macedonia had ever made began to move. The kingdoms Philip had conquered or subdued smelled weakness. A young king, barely past boyhood, inheriting an empire stitched together by his father's genius and iron will. Thebes stirred. Athens whispered of independence and sent congratulatory messages to Persia. Tribes on Macedonia's northern borders broke treaties and sharpened their weapons. Amyntas, a rival claimant to the Macedonian throne, began gathering support. Even within his own court, men who had tolerated Alexander as a prince now evaluated him with fresh, calculating eyes. The ancient world had seen enough young kings destroyed by their inheritance to make the calculation seem reasonable. A boy king, the assumption went, could be managed, could be manipulated, could be given enough rope to hang himself with if he was rash, or enough time to be quietly displaced if he was not. An Athenian senator overheard at a symposium. "Philip is dead. What is left now? A boy. A child who tamed a horse once and read too much Homer. Macedonia's empire will dissolve within the year." They could not have been more wrong. Alexander moved with terrifying speed. In the span of weeks, not months, weeks, he had his rival Amyntas executed, eliminating the threat of a competing claimant before it could crystallize into organized opposition. He crushed a rebellion in Thessaly by marching his army through a mountain pass his enemies had fortified, outflanking them with a route they had assumed impassable. He marched his army to Thrace, suppressed border uprisings in the north with such efficiency that the tribal leaders barely had time to assemble before he was already among them. Then he turned south toward Greece. The speed was the message. An enemy that expected weeks to organize found Alexander already at their gates before their own scouts had reported his departure from the previous campaign. He moved like weather, not like an army. An army could be tracked, anticipated, countered. Weather simply arrived. One by one, The Greek city-states fell back into line, not because Alexander begged or negotiated with sweetness, because they looked at the speed, precision, and utter ruthlessness of his movement and understood this was not a boy playing king. This was a predator who had been patient long enough and was now fully, finally, terrifyingly himself. Side story: the weight of a crown. The night after Philip's funeral, Alexander sat alone in his father's war tent. The maps, the campaign journals, the lists of alliances and their terms, the records of debts owed and favors promised, the intelligence reports on Persian troop movements and the fortification of Persepolis. Philip had built an empire not just with swords but with an administrative genius that most histories undervalue. Running it required as much intellect as conquering it had. Alexander picked up one of the maps and studied it for a long time. The lines of coastlines, the symbols for mountains and rivers, the question marks in the east where cartographers had run out of certainty and begun to speculate. The world his father had assembled was vast. The world beyond it was larger still. He did not weep that night. He told no one what he felt. Those who brought him wine and food in the early hours said his eyes looked different. Not grief exactly. Not the raw, undisciplined grief of an ordinary son. Something more complicated. The grief was there, but it was underneath something else, something that was beginning to crystallize in the silence of that tent, with those maps spread across the table and the whole world waiting. He had inherited a kingdom. He had also inherited his father's unfinished war. And inside that 20-year-old chest, something had shifted. He would not merely be the son who maintained what his father built. He would not be the custodian of Philip's legacy. He would be the man who took that legacy as a starting point and drove it so far beyond its origin that the origin became a footnote. I will not just finish what he started. I will make him look like a beginning. He had silenced those who doubted him. But silence for Alexander was never the goal. The world was watching, and he intended to give it something worth watching. Chapter IV: The Fall of Greece's Enemies. Music, war drums building, relentless, thunderous. 335 BC. One lesson was not enough. For some, the price of defiance would be written in fire. When Thebes received a false rumor that Alexander had been killed in a northern campaign, some say the rumor was deliberately circulated by Persian agents who understood that destabilizing Greece served their interests. They rose in open revolt. The Theban leadership, proud of their city's ancient tradition of military excellence, proud of the sacred band, the elite warrior corps who had defeated Sparta itself, believed the young king was dead. They declared independence, rallied their forces, called upon Athens and other city-states to join them, and began attacking the Macedonian garrison stationed within their city. Alexander was very much alive. He had been fighting in Illyria, hundreds of miles to the north. The moment the news of Thebes's rebellion reached him, he turned his army south and began what would become one of the most astonishing forced marches in military history, covering the distance in 13 days that normal armies would have required 6 weeks to cover, feeding his men from the land as they moved, maintaining discipline and order at a pace that should have been impossible. And he arrived at Thebes's gates in less than 2 weeks. The citizens looked out from their walls and saw, impossibly, the Macedonian army assembled in full battle formation. How? The rumors had said Alexander was hundreds of miles north. The city went very quiet. A confusion, a terrible slow-dawning understanding moved through the population like a cold wave. Someone said, almost to themselves, "It cannot be him." A rider approached the gates bearing Alexander's standard, white and gold against the morning sky. It was him. He was here. He had always been coming. Alexander offered terms. He was, despite everything, not wasteful in his destruction. He gave Thebes the opportunity to surrender the leaders of the rebellion and return to alliance. This was not generosity, it was efficiency. Destroying a city costs resources, time, and political goodwill across the Greek world. A peacefully subdued Thebes would have served his purposes nearly as well. The Theban leadership, proud and ancient, heirs to the warriors who had once made Sparta weep, refused. They sent back a defiant answer. They had chosen. The city fell in a single day. What followed was calculated and terrible. Alexander razed Thebes to the ground. Every building burned except for the temples, whose sanctity he respected, and the house of the great lyric poet Pindar, which Alexander ordered protected and preserved. He had read Pindar's odes. He respected their beauty with a respect that existed entirely separately from his military ruthlessness, in a compartment of his personality that his enemies never quite understood, and that made him more dangerous than a simple destroyer would have been. More than 6,000 Thebans died in the fighting. 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city that had been one of the great powers of Greece for 300 years was erased in a single afternoon. The message echoed across every remaining city-state like a bell struck by a god, enormous, resonant, impossible to ignore. Athenian orator Demades, speaking before the Athenian assembly the following morning. Alexander is no boy, he is an earthquake walking, he is a fire that moves. We will send ambassadors, we will make peace, we will honor every agreement, we will do whatever he asks, and we will do it now before he decides that Athens also requires a lesson. Greece submitted. Athens sent humble congratulations and apologies for any past offenses. Every city that had whispered defiance fell into a silence so complete it had the texture of approval. Alexander was now, without dispute, the supreme commander of all Greek forces, the hegemon of the League of Corinth, and the man who would lead the Greek world's long-anticipated war against Persia. He looked east, always east, toward the empire that had twice invaded Greece and twice been thrown back, toward the empire that had burned the Acropolis, that had desecrated Greek temples, that had sent 1,000,000 men against a few thousand Spartans at the hot gates of Thermopylae, toward Persia. Personal life moment, the promise at Philip's tomb. Before he marched his army toward Asia, Alexander traveled alone to his father's tomb at Igi. His generals waited outside. His bodyguards stood at a respectful distance. The torches along the burial chamber walls flickered in the underground draft, casting moving shadows across the carved reliefs that depicted Philip's greatest victories. It was a room full of a man's life, his achievements arranged in stone and gold. Philip had been extraordinary. History would record him as extraordinary if history remembered him at all once Alexander was done. And that, perhaps, was the complicated truth of the moment. What was said in that room no one knows. Alexander left no record of it. He was not, in his most private moments, a man who performed emotion for an audience. But when he emerged, those closest to him, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, men who had known him since childhood, noted a change. A finality in his bearing, as though a decision made privately had become a vow made before something larger than himself. His father had dreamed of Persian conquest. His father had spent a decade building the army, forging the alliances, creating the conditions for the greatest military campaign the Greek world had ever attempted, and then had died at a wedding in a corridor with a blade between his ribs. Alexander placed his hand on the cold stone of Philip's tomb and made a promise. In the language of kings, in the language of sons, in the language of men who cannot tolerate the sight of their father's unfinished work. I will go further than you ever dared imagine, and when I stand at the edge of the world, I will think of you. Whether this was love or competition or the inseparable fusion of both that defines the deepest relationships between fathers and sons, it hardly matters. He kept the promise, in ways Philip never could have foreseen. Greece was conquered, the army assembled, the sea awaited, and beyond the sea a world that had never met a man like this. Chapter V. Crossing into Asia. Music, swell of strings and horns, triumphant, ominous, vast. 334 BC. 35,000 soldiers stood at the edge of Europe, looking across the narrow water of the Hellespont toward an alien shore. The Hellespont, barely a mile wide at its narrowest point, the thin blue line separating the world Greece knew from the world it had only imagined, was not much of a barrier in physical terms, militarily and psychologically. It was the boundary between everything familiar and everything unknown. Most of the men had never left Greece. Most had never seen an empire. Most were afraid in the specific way that brave men are afraid, not the paralytic fear that prevents movement, but the acute, clarifying fear that sharpens the senses and makes every detail of the moment permanently memorable. The color of the water, the smell of the wind off Asia, the sound of their own breathing. Alexander crossed first. Before his army had fully boarded the transport ships, Alexander steered his own vessel to the middle of the Hellespont, the symbolically and literally exact midpoint between the world he was leaving and the world he was claiming, and hurled his spear into the Asian shore. It struck the earth and stood upright, vibrating with the force of the throw and the weight of what it meant. Alexander, standing at the prow of his ship, his voice carrying across the water, "I take Asia as won by the spear. The gods have given me this land, and I intend to hold what the gods have given." It was a declaration, a ritual, a signal to every soldier watching from the ships behind him. We do not come to negotiate, we come to stay. This is not a raid. This is not a campaign with a return journey planned. This is a conquest, and it begins now. Before the campaign began in earnest, Alexander did something that his generals understood was militarily unnecessary, and yet absolutely necessary in every other sense. He traveled to Troy, the ancient city of the Iliad, the battlefield where Achilles had made his immortal name, where the greatest heroes of the Greek world had fought and died and been remembered forever. Alexander walked the ruins with the careful attention of a pilgrim who has arrived at a sacred site and intends to honor it properly. He placed a wreath on the tomb believed to be Achilles's, anointed it with oil, and ran around it as ancient tradition demanded for honoring the heroic dead. He stood before the grave mound alone in the early dawn light, and something private passed across his face, something his companions had learned to recognize and never interrupt. Not grief, not reverence exactly, something more intimate and more complicated. Competition. The silent acknowledgement between two men, one alive and one legendary, that the contest between them was real and ongoing. Alexander, very quietly to the grave. "You were fortunate, Achilles, to have Homer to sing of your glory while you lived. I must find my own Homer, and I intend to give him more to sing about." The first engagement came quickly. At the Battle of the Granicus River, a Persian cavalry force had positioned itself on the far bank, using the river and its steep banks as a natural defensive barrier. The terrain strongly favored the defenders. Every principle of military logic said, "Wait, find another crossing. Do not charge uphill into prepared cavalry positions across a river current." Alexander charged straight across, not from recklessness, from the calculation that a bold, unexpected action would shatter the psychological cohesion of an enemy that had prepared for a cautious opponent. He was right, and nearly died in the process. A Persian officer named Spithridates nearly split Alexander's skull with an axe. The blow was deflected at the last possible moment by Alexander's helmet and by the intervention of his general Cleitus, who cut off Spithridates's arm mid-swing. It was the first of many times Alexander would come within a moment of death and continue fighting, as though mortality were an inconvenience that applied to other people. The Macedonians broke through, the Persian line collapsed, and the road into Asia Minor lay open. Side story: the king who slept in the mud. Every morning in camp, the soldiers of the Macedonian army woke to find their king already awake, seated at a campfire with the common infantry, eating the same black bread and dried meat, drinking the same thin morning wine from a common cup, not performing accessibility, not making a show of solidarity for political effect, simply present in the way that men who genuinely enjoy the company of soldiers are present. Alexander knew something that many commanders forgot and some never knew. Armies are not machines. They are men. And men do not die for distant kings who sleep behind silk curtains and make decisions from a safe remove. They die for leaders they have looked in the eye. For men who ate the same dust, who shivered through the same cold nights, who cursed the same stiff morning muscles and laughed at the same grim humor that soldiers used to make unbearable circumstances bearable. He learned the names of his soldiers, not just his officers and his generals, but the rank infantry, their home cities, their fathers' professions, how many siblings they had left behind in Macedonia, what they planned to do with their share of any plunder. When men were wounded, he visited them in the field hospital personally, asking about the injury and the treatment and the man's assessment of his own recovery. When men died in battle, he knew their names at the burial, and those names went into the dispatches he sent back to Macedonia, not as statistics but as individuals. He also shared their risks in a way that went beyond what any general was required or even advised to do. He fought at the front, always at the front, not directing from the rear but leading the first charge, the most dangerous charge, the place where the battle was decided. His body accumulated wounds the way a soldier's body does, not career-ending wounds but the constant accumulating damage of a man who stands where the weapons are. Scars on his thigh from a Thracian sword. A shoulder wound from a sling stone. Later, an arrow through his lung at the siege of Multan that punctured the chest cavity and should, by any medical logic, have killed him within hours. This was the loyalty no amount of gold could purchase. This was why 35,000 men followed a 22-year-old king into an empire of 1,000,000 warriors. Why they marched until their feet were raw and their backs were broken, and their families had become memories, so faded they struggled to remember exactly the sound of their children's voices. They did not follow the crown, they followed him. The gateway to the Persian Empire stood open, and waiting somewhere in its depths was a man with an army of 500,000. His name was Darius III, and he was coming. Chapter VI, The Battle Against Darius. Music, full orchestral swell, battle hymn, chaos, then silence. 333 BC. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. 2 civilizations, 2 kings, 1 coastal plain in southern Anatolia called Issus, and a battle that would determine the fate of the ancient world. Darius III, King of Kings, Emperor of Persia, Lord of all lands from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, arrived at Issus with a force that defied easy comprehension. The numbers in ancient sources vary wildly, from a credible 80,000 to the almost certainly exaggerated 600,000. The truth is likely somewhere between 100 and 200,000. Still a force so vastly larger than Alexander's 40,000 that the disparity seems to belong to different categories of military reality. Darius himself was a physically imposing man, tall, aristocratic, genuinely brave in the personal sense, and by most accounts a reasonable administrator of his sprawling empire. He was not, however, a military genius. He had inherited an empire rather than built one, and the Persian military system, for all its vast numbers, had structural weaknesses that a mind like Alexander's could identify and exploit with terrible precision. He rode a golden war chariot at the center of his formation, surrounded by his royal bodyguard, his wives and mother and daughters watching from a protected position behind the lines. For Darius, bringing his family to a major battle was not vanity. It was tradition, a demonstration of his absolute confidence in the outcome. A Persian king did not go to battle expecting to lose. In the pre-dawn hours, Alexander walked through the rows of sleeping men, lantern in hand. He looked at their faces, farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen's sons from coastal villages in Macedonia and Thessaly and Greece, and then looked east at the fires of the Persian camp, stretching for miles along the plain in the darkness like a second sky of fallen stars. He blew out his lantern and stood in the dark for a long moment. Alone with the sound of 60,000 men sleeping, and one massive army preparing for morning. Then he went to his tent and prepared his armor. The tactics of Issus are still studied in military academies today. Alexander had identified the critical weakness in Darius's formation. The terrain at Issus was narrow, compressed between the sea and the mountains, which negated the Persian numerical advantage. 1,000,000 soldiers packed into a narrow corridor fight no more effectively than 40,000. The numbers meant nothing if they couldn't deploy. Furthermore, there was a gap between the Persian infantry center and the cavalry on the right flank, a seam in the formation that, if struck with sufficient speed and force, would split the army in two before it could respond. Alexander drove his elite companion cavalry directly through that seam like a spear through the chest of a giant. He did not command the cavalry from behind, he led it. Alexander rode at the absolute head of the charge, his white-plumed helmet visible from every part of the battlefield, a fixed point of light and identity in the storm of steel and blood and screaming horses. His presence at the front was not symbolic. It was tactical. When soldiers see their king at the spearhead of the decisive charge, they do not hesitate. They match his speed. They match his commitment. They fight with an intensity that soldiers who are merely following orders cannot access. The Persian line buckled. Then it broke. And then Darius, watching his formation collapse from his golden chariot, made the decision that would define his legacy. He turned his horses and fled. He left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, his treasury, and his reputation. He left behind the symbols and supports of everything a Persian king was supposed to be. He saved his life and lost everything else. Alexander, when told that the Persian royal family was now his prisoner, ordered immediately that they be treated with the full honor and comfort due to their station. No harm, no humiliation, every courtesy. He visited Darius' mother, Sisygambis, who in the confusion of the captured camp prostrated herself before Hephaestion, mistaking the tall, handsome general for Alexander himself. When the error was quietly pointed out to her, Sisygambis was horrified. She began to apologize. Alexander raised her to her feet with genuine kindness. Alexander, looking at this woman who had expected execution and was receiving courtesy. "Do not be afraid, he is alive, your son, and you have not lost a son, you have gained another one." It was a line that could have been purely political, the calculated generosity of a conqueror who understood the propaganda value of magnanimity. But those who witnessed it said it was delivered without performance, as if he meant it. Sisygambis lived the rest of her life under Alexander's care and by ancient account loved him genuinely. When Alexander died, she refused food and died 5 days later, unwilling to survive the son she had gained. Personal life moment, victory and the shadow within. After Issus, the feasting went on for days. The captured Persian treasury alone contained mountains of gold. The royal tents were palaces of silk and carved ivory and silver. Alexander's generals moved through the captured splendor like men who had stepped into a dream they had not known they were eligible for. But Alexander, that night, sat alone at the central table in the Persian king's captured tent, in the chair where Darius had sat. He had bathed in Darius' golden bathtub, the first hot bath he had taken since leaving Greece. He had eaten Darius' food and drunk Darius' wine from Darius' cups. He had placed himself, deliberately, inside the physical space of the man he had defeated. He looked at the gold around him for a long time. Then he said something to Parmenion, one of his senior generals, that entered the historical record because those nearby understood it was significant. "So this, it seems, is what it means to be a king." Not satisfaction, a question in the form of a statement, an uncertainty beneath the victory. The lean, righteous ambition of a young soldier from Macedonia was beginning to be replaced by something heavier. Something that wore the shape of ambition but functioned differently. Something that needed more to fill it with every passing victory, that expanded to consume each new achievement and immediately required another. a hunger that eating made hungrier. He looked at the gold around him and felt, for the first time, not satisfied but hungrier. He had defeated the King of Kings on the battlefield, but Persia had not fallen. Darius was alive, rebuilding. An empire stretching from Egypt to the edge of the world still awaited. Alexander marched on. Chapter VII, Egypt and the Birth of a Legend. Music, haunting flutes, ancient scales, the desert at dawn. 332 BC. He had conquered armies. Now he would conquer imaginations. Egypt did not resist Alexander. It embraced him. The Persian rulers who had governed Egypt for the previous 2 centuries had been, from the Egyptian perspective, foreign occupiers of the worst kind, men who had desecrated temples, slaughtered sacred animals, and treated the oldest civilization on earth as a resource to be extracted. When Alexander arrived at the gates of Memphis, the priests opened them and welcomed him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The contrast with Persian rule was immediate and deliberate. Alexander made sacrifice to the Egyptian gods. He honored the sacred Apis bull. He walked through the temple complexes at Memphis with the reverence of a man who understood that he was in the presence of something vast and ancient and not to be treated carelessly, whether his reverence was genuine or political or both. And in Alexander, these things were rarely separable. Its effect was the same. Egypt did not merely accept him. It claimed him. Thousands of Egyptians lined the processional road through Memphis. Priests in white linen held the sacred symbols of Amun aloft. Alexander rode through on Bucephalus, and the crowd fell into a silence that was not the silence of fear or submission, but the deeper silence of witnessing something they had been waiting for without quite knowing they were waiting. Then Alexander made a grueling journey west across the Libyan desert to the oasis of Siwa, home to the Oracle of Amun, one of the most sacred oracular sites in the ancient world. The journey nearly killed his escort. The desert disoriented even his most experienced guides. Ancient sources describe a wind that obscured the path and a miraculous rain that saved the party from dying of thirst. Whether these events occurred as described, the fact of the journey itself, a king risking his life in the desert to consult an oracle, tells us something essential about who Alexander was at this moment. He sought the validation not of men, who had already given it to him, but of gods. What the oracle told him, he never repeated in full. He said only that he had received the answer his heart desired. Those who watched him emerge from the inner sanctum of the temple noted that something had changed in his face, not a new expression, but the hardening of an existing one, as though something he had half believed about himself had been confirmed in the darkness of the sanctuary, and now he was done half believing it. The priests called him the son of Amun, the son of Zeus in Greek terms, the god's own king. Alexander accepted this without apparent discomfort, and here is where the man becomes genuinely difficult to interpret. Did he believe it literally? Did he accept it as politically useful? Did the distinction matter to him? The ancient world was not the modern world, and the boundary between human and divine was not drawn in the same place. A man who had done what Alexander had already done by the age of 25 might reasonably wonder whether the usual categories applied to him. Then he built a city, Alexandria. He did not assign the planning to an architect and move on. He personally walked the site at the western edge of the Nile Delta, where the Mediterranean wind came off the sea, and the land between the sea and the lake offered the natural harbor he had been looking for. He walked the perimeter of what would become the city, trailing white barley flour from a sack to mark the lines of the future streets, the position of the agora, the location of the great temple, the space reserved for the library that would hold the accumulated knowledge of the world. When the barley was exhausted before the circuit was complete, an aide offered to bring more. Alexander told them to use the grain reserves from the supply train. His generals exchanged glances. He was drawing a city in wheat meant for soldiers. He did not care. The city was more important. Alexandria would become, within a generation of his death, the most important city in the Mediterranean world, a city of nearly 1 million people, the home of the greatest library in history, the birthplace of mathematical and scientific advances that shaped the next 1,000 years of human civilization. A city that outlasted every army he ever led. A city that still exists today, bearing his name. 23 centuries after he walked its planned streets in the Mediterranean dust. Side story, the question he dared not ask aloud. In Egypt, surrounded by temples older than his civilization by thousands of years, by priests who spoke of time in millennia rather than generations, by gods who had been worshipped continuously since before Greece existed, and who would continue to be worshipped long after Greece was a memory, Alexander grew quiet in a way his companions had rarely seen. The busyness of conquest, the perpetual motion of campaign life, was stripped away for a few weeks in this ancient place. And in the stillness, something surfaced that the motion had kept submerged. He stood at the base of the great monuments and felt, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of time. Everything he had done, every battle, every city taken, every kingdom subdued, existed in the thin present moment of his own lifetime. These monuments had been standing for 2,000 years before his birth. They would stand for 2,000 years after his death. Against that scale, even the world's greatest living conqueror was a brief event. A flash of intensity in an enormously long story. For the first time, a question formed behind those dark, relentless eyes. A question he never wrote down, never spoke aloud to his generals, but that those who knew him best could see shaping his face in unguarded moments. Is greatness making me less human? Is the weight of what I'm becoming, the god king, the son of Zeus, the conqueror of continents, replacing something that was simply a man? And if it is that the price? And is the price too high? He had no answer. The desert offered none. He buried the question under the next campaign, the next horizon, the next battle. But it never stopped being there. In every subsequent year, in every new country, in every moment of triumph followed by the familiar hollow feeling of achievement completed and insufficiently satisfying, the question returned, quieter each time but more insistent. Egypt was his, the Mediterranean was his, and somewhere in the burning east Darius was raising a new army. The reckoning was coming. Chapter VII, The Edge of the World. Music, deep, sparse, elemental wind across open plains. 331–326 BC. 5 years of marching. 5 years of cold mountains and baking deserts and rivers that no map had ever drawn. 5 years since any of them had heard their own language spoken by someone they had not met on campaign. 5 years since most of them had slept in a bed, eaten a meal cooked by someone who loved them, or heard the uncomplicated, ordinary sounds of home. After the final, decisive defeat of Darius at Gaugamela, a battle where Alexander shattered a Persian force estimated between 200,000 and 1,000,000 with 47,000 soldiers, the Persian Empire officially ended. Darius fled east and was killed by his own satrap Bessus, who believed that murdering the king and offering the body to Alexander might purchase his survival. It did not. Alexander found Darius dying on the roadside, wrapped him in his own cloak, and wept. Not performed grief, genuine grief for a man he had never spoken to, whose life he had upended, whose family he had treated with more kindness than their own countrymen ultimately showed. He buried Darius with full royal honors, because Alexander understood, had always understood, that how you treat the people you defeat says more about who you are than how you defeat them. He kept marching through the royal cities of Persepolis, where he burned the great palace in a moment that ancient sources describe variously as a deliberate political act, a drunken decision he later regretted, or both simultaneously. Through Ecbatana and Susa, into the wild, unmapped eastern territories that no Greek soldier had ever entered, the lands that are now Afghanistan, Pakistan, the northwestern edge of India. The Hindu Kush in winter. This is where the romance of conquest confronts its physical reality most brutally. The passes at 15,000 feet, where the air is too thin and the cold is absolute. Men's fingers turned black with frostbite and had to be cut off to prevent the dead flesh from spreading. Horses collapsed and could not be revived. The baggage train slowed to a creep, and at the head of the column, through all of it, Alexander moved. Not quickly enough that his army could not follow, but fast enough that the pace itself was a statement. We are not stopping. Cold is not a reason. Mountains are not a reason. Nothing is a reason. The army moved through it because he moved through it, and because they had learned by now that he had never led them somewhere they could not survive. By 326 BC, they stood at the Hydaspes River in what is now Pakistan, facing King Porus of the Paurava kingdom. Porus was a formidable figure, nearly 7 feet tall by ancient accounts, a capable general, and the commander of an army that included something the Macedonians had never faced in pitched battle: war elephants. Hundreds of them. Animals the size of houses, armored and guided by skilled handlers, capable of breaking infantry formations through sheer terror even before they physically engaged. Alexander watched the elephants from across the river for several days. He studied their movements, their behavior, how they responded to commands, whether they were afraid of anything. He was still the student who had once turned a frightened horse to face the sun. He crossed the river at night in a monsoon rainstorm, in 3 separate groups designed to confuse the defenders about where the main crossing was. He maneuvered Porus into a position where the elephants could not deploy effectively. He used his cavalry to threaten the flanks, forcing Porus to spread his force thin, trying to cover every direction. He won, against war elephants, against monsoon conditions, against a general who was genuinely skilled. He won. And then he honored Porus as kings should honor each other, with restoration and respect. When asked what terms he wanted, Porus gave the only answer Alexander fully respected. Porus, wounded, standing in chains before the king who had just defeated him. Treat me as a king. Alexander looking at the man for a long moment, then nodding. That I will, but ask something for yourself. Porus, everything I want is contained in that one request. Alexander returned his kingdom and appointed him a regional administrator of the expanded Indian territories, one of the highest honors he could offer a defeated enemy, because Alexander recognized greatness even in the men he beat, and recognized that treating a great man as less than great diminishes the victory. Personal life moment, the fear of becoming ordinary. In the rare quiet evenings of the Indian campaign, when even the ceaseless momentum that defined his existence seemed to pause for breath, Alexander would write to his mother. The letters traveled by fast rider across thousands of miles of conquered territory, through passes in the Hindu Kush, across the Persian plateau, through the royal road network that now served his empire, across the sea to Macedonia. He asked about home with a specificity that surprised those who carried the letters. Not grand questions about the state of the kingdom or the political situation in Greece, but small things. Whether the old horse trainer at the Pella stables was still alive, what the autumn had been like along the Macedonian coast, whether the pomegranate trees in the lower garden had fruited well that year. He missed home, more than he ever admitted publicly, more than his relentless forward momentum suggested. He missed the specific textures of the world he had left, the simplicity of being a person rather than a legend, the freedom of wanting ordinary things without those wants being interpreted as signs of weakness or indecision. But when anyone, general, friend, advisor, the woman or man he was sleeping beside that season, suggested they had gone far enough, that the army was exhausted, that there was honor enough already and no shame in returning home, something in Alexander tightened like a fist around something fragile. The idea of stopping, of going back, of walking into a room in Greece or Macedonia and being greeted as a great general rather than the greatest man who had ever lived. of sitting across a dinner table from men who had been his age when he left and had since become fathers and farmers and local magistrates, and having nothing to say to each other across the distance that his decade of impossible achievement had created. He could not tolerate it. The fear of being ordinary, the fear of collapsing back into the scale of merely human achievement was, in the end, the most powerful force in his life. It drove him past exhaustion, past loneliness, past grief, past wisdom, past the point where a happy man would have stopped. It drove him almost to India, almost to the edge of the world. And then, finally, it could not drive his army. He had reached the edge of the world, the Greeks knew, but there was more world beyond it. Alexander looked east with burning eyes. His army looked back at him with something else entirely. Chapter IX, The King Who Couldn't Stop. Music, slow, sorrowful strings, something breaking. 326 BC. For the first time in his life, Alexander faced an enemy he could not defeat with speed or tactics or personal courage. He faced the will of the men who had followed him to the end of the world, and for the first time, that will was pointed in a different direction than his own. At the Hyphasis River, the furthest point of advance, the boundary beyond which even Alexander's intelligence reports became uncertain, his army stopped. Not in battle, not from defeat at enemy hands. They simply stopped marching and refused to go further. 8 years. 8 years since they had left the shores of the Hellespont. The men were old by ancient standards, scarred, sick, carrying injuries that had never fully healed because there had never been enough time to fully heal them. Missing fingers and eyes and pieces of themselves they would never recover. Their boots had worn out a dozen times. They had crossed 4 major mountain ranges and 3 great river systems. They had fought in terrain that ranged from Mediterranean coastline to Himalayan passes to Indian monsoon floodplains. They had buried friends in a dozen countries. They could not picture the faces of their children without effort. They wanted to go home, not as a preference, as a need, as something their bodies and spirits had reached the absolute limit of being able to defer. His generals came to him in the command tent, Coenus, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Craterus, men he had fought beside for the entirety of his adult life. Their faces were worn stone, not angry, not mutinous, just finished. They looked at their king with the steady eyes of men who had given everything that could be given and had now arrived at the edge of the account. Outside the tent, the sound of 60,000 soldiers who had made a collective decision without meeting, without a ringleader, without conspiracy, who had simply all reached the same point simultaneously and stopped. General Coenus speaking for the army, his voice steady and without apology. Sir, if there is one thing above all others a successful man should know, it is when to stop. Look at these men. They have grown old in your service. Look at their bodies, the scars, the missing limbs, the gray in hair that was black when we left Macedonia. They long to see their parents again, those who are still alive. They long to see their wives, their children who were infants when we left and are now old enough to wonder whether their fathers are still alive. Have pity on them. They have done enough. More than enough. More than any soldiers in the history of the world. Alexander said nothing for a long moment. Then he went into his tent alone. He stayed there for 3 days. Those outside heard nothing. No weeping, no raging, no breaking of furniture or shouting at aides. Just the silence of a man confronting, for the first time in his life, a limit that could not be overcome by courage or intelligence or force of will. The silence of someone who had built his entire identity on the refusal of limits, and was now standing at the edge of the one limit that was absolute. The limit of what other people could give. He emerged on the 4th day, his face composed, his bearing exactly what it always was, upright, direct, radiating the calm authority of a man who is never uncertain about what needs to be done next. He said the omens were unfavorable. He said the gods had spoken. He ordered the army to turn back. He never admitted it was defeat, but he built 12 enormous altars at the furthest point of his advance, one for each Olympian god, as if marking the place where he had been stopped, as if asking the gods to note that he had reached this point and gone no further only because they had willed it, not because he had chosen it. Those who knew Alexander knew the truth, and kept it to themselves with the loyal discretion of men who understood that some truths serve no purpose by being spoken aloud. The army had broken his heart, not through betrayal, through having been human, through having been mortal, through having been men rather than the instrument of divine will that he sometimes needed them to be. Side story: the price of conquest. The refusal at Ephesus did not arrive without warning. For years, the campaign had been fraying things that could not be repaired. Hephaestion, Alexander's oldest friend, the man he loved beyond any romantic attachment or family bond, the one he called his other soul, the only person in the world he seems to have trusted with the full weight of who he actually was, remained beside him. But Hephaestion was mortal too. He died of fever in Ecbatana in 324 BC, just a year before Alexander himself. When the news reached Alexander, he was inconsolable in a way he had never permitted himself to be for any other loss. He lay beside the body for 3 days. He cut his hair, the ancient sign of deepest mourning. He ordered the mane and tail of Bucephalus cut in tribute. He commissioned a tomb of extraordinary magnificence and sent to the oracle at Siwa asking whether Hephaestion might be worshipped as a god. He drank more after Hephaestion died. He was already drinking more than he should have been for years, a habit that the campaign lifestyle enabled and that the loneliness of supreme power made worse. He ate less. He drove himself harder in the months following, as though exhausting his body was the only way to stop his mind. Years earlier, the worst night had already happened. A drunken feast in Maracanda, a bitter argument about credit and honor between Alexander and his general Cletus. The same Cletus who had saved his life at Granicus by cutting off the arm of the Persian officer whose axe was aimed at Alexander's skull. Cletus, drunk, had accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian customs for Persian ones, of forgetting the men who had made him great, of attributing his victories to himself rather than his soldiers. It was not entirely wrong, and Alexander, drunk and exhausted and surrounded by sycophants, had heard it the way leaders who surround themselves with too much agreement hear genuine criticism, as an attack, as betrayal. He grabbed a spear from a guard's hand. Someone knocked it aside. He grabbed another. Cletus died at the foot of the table. The room went absolutely still. Alexander looked down at the man who had saved his life 14 years before and understood immediately, completely, and permanently what he had done. He collapsed. He wept for 3 days. He called for his own death. His generals stood outside his tent in rotation, not to guard him from enemies but to prevent him from harming himself. The world's greatest conqueror had become, in a moment of wine-dark rage, the killer of his own friend. No campaign, no trophy, no empire could undo that moment. It lived inside him forever after, quiet and permanent, and those closest to him said they could see it behind his eyes even in his most triumphant hours. A darkness that was not depression exactly, but was the specific weight of something irreversible. Conquest, it turned out, does not cure loneliness. It compounds it. The higher you climb, the fewer people can reach you. The greater you become, the smaller the circle of those who know you rather than merely the version of you that history requires. The army turned west. Alexander sat at the head of the column and did not look back, not once. The horizon behind him held every victory he had ever won. The horizon ahead held only the road home and whatever waited at the end of it. Chapter X: Death of a Legend. Music, a single horn alone, ancient and mournful. Babylon, 323 BC. The center of the world's greatest empire. A city of hanging gardens and ziggurats and astronomical observatories, and 100 languages spoken simultaneously in a single marketplace. A city that had existed for 2,000 years before Alexander arrived, and would endure for centuries after him. He had chosen it as his capital, the throne room of everything he had won, the central point of an empire so vast that no single city at its edge could serve as its heart. He was 32 years old. He had been at war continuously for 10 years. His body was a record of that decade, the accumulated damage of wounds and forced marches and inadequate sleep and too much wine, and the kind of chronic stress that does not announce itself until the body finally presents the full account. And yet he was making new plans. Arabia. He wanted Arabia, the great peninsula that sat between his eastern and western territories, unconquered, unknown, its interior a blank space on any map his cartographers could produce. After Arabia, the western Mediterranean. Carthage, the great North African power. Perhaps after that, a circumnavigation of the entire African continent, a feat that would not actually be accomplished until the Portuguese sailors of the 15th century, nearly 1800 years later. His engineers were already designing a fleet of 1,500 warships. His generals, watching him spread new maps across the campaign table with the same bright, hungry attention they had seen in his face at 20, felt a feeling they knew by now. The complicated mixture of awe and exhaustion that was the permanent condition of serving Alexander. He would never stop. They understood that with absolute certainty now. The mutiny at Ephesus had not cured him of forward motion. It had redirected it. He had turned west and immediately begun planning the next conquest. The engine that drove him was not connected to any external goal. It was not conquer Persia or reach India or build an empire. It was something inside him that would continue consuming whatever he fed it and immediately requiring more, until either the world ran out of unconquered territory or the body that housed the engine finally gave out. The body gave out first. In late May of 323 BC, following a lavish feast in Babylon, accounts differ on the details. Some mention extraordinary quantities of wine. Alexander complained of pain spreading across his upper back. He waved it off. He had survived an arrow through his lung. He had survived sword wounds and spear wounds and a stone to the head. He had dragged himself off battlefields on which lesser men had died from lesser injuries. He did not yield to fevers. The fever did not yield to him. For 11 days it intensified. The best physicians in the empire were summoned from every direction: Greek physicians, Persian physicians, Egyptian physicians trained in the medical traditions of the oldest civilization on earth. They applied the treatments available to them with skill and genuine desperation. Nothing helped. The fever climbed. The body that had been pushed past every human limit for a decade was reaching the end of what it could absorb. Word spread through Babylon and then through the empire. The king was sick. The king was dying. Soldiers who had marched with him for a decade left their posts and gathered outside the palace walls, not ordered to, not organized, simply drawn by something they could not name. An army that had crossed the known world together does not receive the news of its leaders dying passively. His generals eventually arranged for Alexander to be carried on a litter to the great hall of the palace, where his soldiers could file past him one final time. 10,000 men moving in a slow, silent river past a man on a litter who could barely lift his head. His eyes were open. His mind was present. He recognized their faces, men he had fought beside, men whose names he knew, men whose bravery he had witnessed in specific moments on specific fields in specific countries, whose names most of Greece had never heard. Each soldier touched his hand or his arm as they passed. Some wept openly. Some were silent in the way that men are silent when they have no language for what they are feeling and do not reach for inadequate words. Some simply looked at him for as long as the slow movement of the column allowed, storing the image, the last actual sight of the living man, against the long years of remembering that they understood were coming. When his generals asked him who should inherit his empire, the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced, containing dozens of nations, hundreds of languages, millions of people, He whispered his final recorded words with the characteristic, devastating, perfectly Alexander-like combination of wisdom and chaos. To the strongest. He died on June 10, 323 BC, 32 years old. He had ruled Macedonia for 13 years. He had been at war for 10. In that time, he had conquered an empire stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the borders of India, over 3 million square miles, through the Nile Valley and the Hindu Kush and the Zagros Mountains and the Libyan Desert and the plains of the Punjab. He had founded dozens of cities. He had never lost a battle. He had built, in a single lifetime, the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, and had done it before the age that most modern people consider the beginning of serious adulthood. The exact cause of his death remains one of history's most debated questions. Typhoid fever, complicated by years of alcohol consumption and repeated trauma to the body. West Nile virus, poisoning by political enemies, there were enough of them. Guillain-Barré syndrome, the simplest explanation perhaps, a body asked to do too much for too many years, finally and absolutely refusing to continue. In 2019, a medical historian proposed one more possibility that caught the world's attention. Ancient accounts describe Alexander's body remaining uncorrupted and lifelike for 6 days after his apparent death. No decomposition, no discoloration. This, combined with a gradual paralysis noted in the final days, led to speculation that he may not have been dead when buried, that he may have been suffering from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition that can cause complete paralysis while leaving the mind fully conscious, that the greatest conqueror who ever lived may have been conscious inside a body that could no longer move, while the world proceeded to mourn him. Whether true or not, the story feels somehow appropriate for a man who spent his entire life refusing to accept limits, even the limit of his own death. He conquered kingdoms, defeated empires, and became a name feared across the world. But in the end, even Alexander the Great could not conquer time. And Alexander III of Macedon, 356 to 323 BC, king of Macedonia, Pharaoh of Egypt, king of Persia, lord of Asia, he never lost a battle. He never stopped moving. He never became ordinary.